Usually when we look at a massive construction project, like a skyscraper or a suspension bridge, there is this expectation of strict sequential logic.
Oh, sure. You need the blueprints first.
Yeah, the architect drafts the blueprints, then the foundation is poured, the steel skeleton goes up, and finally you do the finishing touches. Everything has a cause, and everything follows a strictly ordered timeline.
It is entirely linear. I mean, you do not install the glass windows before you have the structural walls. The order of operations is, well, it's what makes the structure actually stand.
But then you step into the world of medieval theology and cosmic history, and suddenly that linear, sensible blueprint is turned completely upside down. We are looking at a theological landscape today that asks us to reconsider the very sequence of the universe.
And it is a massive shift in perspective.
It really is. I want you, the listener, to just imagine the entire cosmos for a second. Think of the billions of galaxies, the unfathomable stretches of deep time, the formation of stars, and the eventual arrival of humanity on this little pale blue dot. Now, ask yourself a question that has divided philosophers for centuries.
Big one.
Yeah. Was the arrival of Christ a plan B? Meaning, was incarnation essentially a divine rescue mission, like a reactionary pivot designed only after humanity stumbled into sin in the Garden of Eden? Or, and this is where it gets wild, was the incarnation the entire reason the universe was built in the first place?
Was the God-man plan A all along? That tension between a reactionary rescue mission and an eternal master plan is really the core mystery we are unpacking in this conversation.
And we have a fascinating stack of documents to guide us through this deep dive into the source material. We are looking at historical records, biographical memoirs, complex theological treatises.
All of them revolve around one guy.
Yes, the thought of a medieval Franciscan named Blessed John Duns Scotus. But his dense 13th century philosophy was actually championed by a rather extraordinary modern figure, Blessed Gabriele Maria Allegra.
And while our sources include these detailed historical texts about Father Allegra translating the first complete Catholic Bible into Chinese, the true beating heart of these documents is Allegra's treatise on Scotus's doctrine,
which is called the Absolute Primacy of Christ.
Yeah, and it is a concept that shifts the entire narrative of creation.
To even begin to understand this mind-bending theology, I feel like we first need to understand the man who carried these dense medieval ideas all the way to China in the middle of the 20th century. So let's look at Blessed Gabriele Maria Allegra. He lived from 1907 to 1976 and is widely known as the St. Jerome of China.
The comparison to St. Jerome is incredibly fitting, really, when you look at the sheer scale of his work. Jerome, of course, translated the Bible into Latin in the late 4th century.
Which made the scriptures accessible to the vast Western Roman Empire.
Yeah, that Latin Vulgate shaped Western civilization. And Allegra took on a similarly monumental linguistic task for the East. He spent decades, translating the Bible from the original Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek into Chinese.
Just grueling work.
Incredible effort. The result of this lifelong project was the Sigao Shengjing, which was finally published in a single complete volume in 1968.
Decades of work, culminating in 1968. Just the sheer stamina required for that is staggering to me. I mean, you are navigating the complexities of ancient Hebrew poetry and Greek philosophical terms and trying to convey them accurately using Chinese characters.
Characters that carry their own deep, thousands of years old cultural connotations.
Right. I mean, yes, it's a massive undertaking. But here's where the story takes a really fascinating turn in our sources. The name of this Bible, Sigao, is actually the Chinese transliteration for Duns Scotus. His full name rendered in Chinese is Ruong Tong Sigao. So Allegra names this landmark Chinese translation of the Bible after a 13th century Scottish friar.
It is a profound choice. Duns Scotus is a towering figure in medieval scholasticism. Now, for you listening, scholasticism was the highly structured system of theology and philosophy taught in medieval European universities.
Lots of rigorous dialectical reasoning.
Very rigorous. Yeah. It was heavily focused on trying to reconcile Christian theology with classical philosophy, particularly Aristotle. Within that intense intellectual world, Scotus was often referred to as the Doctor Subtilis, or the subtle doctor.
Because of the extreme nuance of his thought.
Yes. He's also known as the Doctor of the Incarnate Word. And your observation about the naming convention brings up the central mystery of Allegra's life. Why would a 20th century missionary laboring in the Far East to bring the scriptures to the Chinese people name his life's monumental work after a medieval philosopher from Scotland?
It does seem like a massive collision of worlds. I look at this and think, isn't translating the entire Bible into Chinese already difficult enough? You are trying to bridge the ancient Near East with modern Asia? How does layering extremely dense medieval Scottish philosophy on top of that linguistic mountain actually help?
It sounds counterintuitive.
It sounds like trying to build a suspension bridge while simultaneously composing a symphony. You are just adding an unbelievable amount of cognitive load to an already impossible task.
I hear you. But to understand Allegra's reasoning, we have to look deeply into his devotion to the Franciscan charism. When we say charism, we are talking about the specific spiritual flavor, the unique gift or focus that defines a religious order.
And for the Franciscans, that charism is deeply rooted in poverty, humility, and the supreme overflowing love of Christ.
Yeah. For Allegra, the translation of the Bible was not merely a philological exercise. It wasn't just about matching words in a dictionary. It was a deeply theological, almost mystical endeavor.
How so?
He believed that Scotus's doctrine of the absolute primacy of Christ was the essential master key to unlocking and understanding the entirety of sacred scripture.
Yeah.
He did not view Scotus's theology as an added burden or an extra layer of complication.
Oh, I see.
Rather, he saw it as the foundational blueprint that made the massive, sprawling architecture of the Bible coherent.
The sources outline this incredible concept Allegra had, describing his translation work as the Word becoming book. He drew a direct, tangible parallel to the incarnation itself.
Yes, that is a beautiful image.
Just as the ultimate plan of God was the divine word taking on human flesh, Allegra viewed the translation process with the exact same reverence. He saw his agonizingly slow translation work as a sort of new incarnation. The divine word was taking on a new body within the Chinese language and culture.
He literally wrote that the translation must be a work of piety and sound biblical science, requiring the same dignity and wisdom with which a priest celebrates the Mass.
Wow, think about the weight of that statement.
He begged the Virgin Mary daily for the spiritual anointing and intelligence needed to explain the scriptures properly. For Allegra, giving the word a Chinese body through the Sigao Bible was a continuation of the physical incarnation of Christ into the material world.
And because Duns Scotus was the ultimate theologian of the incarnation, the thinker who elevated the arrival of Christ to the highest possible cosmic importance, Scotus was the only logical patron for this endeavor.
That is the connection.
That reframes the entire translation process for me. It moves it from, a dusty desk job in a library to a sacred, almost liturgical act. But to truly grasp why Allegra was so obsessed with Scotus, we have to open up Allegra's actual treatise.
We need to look at the theological architecture.
Yeah, the architecture that changes the Christian narrative from the ground up.
This brings us to the true centerpiece of our conversation today, the absolute primacy of Christ. We are going to carefully unpack 5 specific assertions that Blessed Gabriele Allegra highlights from the writings of Duns Scotus. Together, these form what is often called the Franciscan thesis.
And the overarching premise is what we hinted at in the very beginning. The incarnation of the Word was not a reaction to the fall of Adam. It was the absolute foundation of God's plan from all eternity.
So if we throw out the traditional timeline of creation, where the incarnation is a response to human failure, where does this new blueprint actually start?
The first assertion gives us the foundational rule. The Latin phrase Scotus uses is summunde opus non potest esse occasionatum. Translated into English, that means the greatest work of God cannot be occasioned or conditioned by sin.
To put it another way, the masterpiece of all creation cannot be a mere byproduct of a mistake.
That makes a lot of sense.
If we view the incarnation, the incomprehensible reality of the infinite God becoming a finite man, as the absolute pinnacle of divine action outside of the Trinity itself, it defies all philosophical logic to say that this pinnacle only happened because Adam ate the forbidden fruit.
Allegra makes this incredibly vivid by quoting a judgment from a 19th century Anglican convert to Catholicism, Father Frederick Faber.
And Faber's 3 consequences.
Yeah, Faber outlines 3 what he calls monstrous consequences that would logically follow if we believe Christ was decreed only after humanity sinned. I want us to look at these closely for you listening because they really expose the cracks in the rescue mission theory.
They really do.
First, Faber says, if Christ came only to fix our mess, then Christ would owe us a debt of gratitude.
The theological and logical reasoning there is profound. Think about cause and effect. If the only reason the God-man exists in the universe is because humanity fell into sin, then humanity's sin is the literal cause of Christ's existence in the flesh.
Wait, so Christ would have to thank us for sinning?
In a bizarre, almost backwards twist of logic, yes. The Creator would be dependent on the creature's failure in order to achieve his own greatest manifestation. If humanity hadn't sinned, Christ would never have been born. Therefore, Christ has to thank Adam's rebellion for his own humanity.
Oh, wow. That leads directly to Faber's second monstrous consequence.
Sure.
If this were true, we would be greater than him in some aspects.
Because we forced his hand.
Yeah, if our actions, even our rebellious, destructive actions, dictate the actions of the divine, we are essentially holding the steering wheel of cosmic history. God is just riding in the passenger seat, reacting to where we drive the car.
The creature would be dictating the terms to the Creator. And the third consequence, Faber points out, is perhaps the most striking of all. Sin would be strictly necessary for his existence.
Which is a huge philosophical trap.
It is. If Christ is the greatest possible good in the universe, and he only comes into the universe because of sin, then sin is no longer an absolute evil to be avoided at all costs. Instead, sin becomes a necessary, almost fortunate prerequisite for the greatest good.
And the Franciscan thesis vehemently rejects this entire line of thinking.
Let's use an analogy to really ground this for you. Imagine a master architect who spends his entire life dreaming of building a magnificent, breathtaking cathedral. It is his ultimate masterpiece. It is the very reason he became an architect.
So the stained glass, the soaring buttresses, the intricate stonework, it's all perfectly formed in his mind.
Yes. Now, imagine someone breaks a small, dirty window in a tiny, dilapidated tool shed on the very edge of the property. The architect doesn't suddenly design and build the magnificent cathedral just to fix the window in the shed.
That would be absurd.
The cathedral was always the goal. The broken window in the shed might dictate some specific minor actions the architect takes while he is on the property. Perhaps he brings different tools that day, or he alters his schedule to board up the shed before laying the foundation. But the cathedral itself was the primary intention from the very first moment he put pen to paper.
I see. So if the incarnation wasn't just God's reaction to a broken window in the shed, if the magnificent cathedral was always the eternal goal, what was the actual catalyst? If we remove human failure from the equation, what is the driving force that prompts the Creator to build this cathedral in the first place?
To answer that, we have to look at the very nature of God according to this framework, which brings us to the second assertion.
Okay.
Scotus says, infinite love desires infinite love. God wanted to be loved by another who could love him in the highest infinite degree.
We really need to unpack the philosophical weight of that.
God in Christian theology is defined as infinite love. And as the texts point out, all of creation is soaked in love. When God creates anything, a star, a tree, an animal, it is an act of sheer love, and it naturally includes a desire to receive love in return.
But there is a mathematical limitation here, isn't there?
Yes, we could call it an ontological problem.
Let's define ontological for our listener, because that's a heavy word. Ontology is the philosophical study of being, of what things actually are in their fundamental nature.
So an ontological problem is a problem rooted in the very nature of existence. The problem here is one of capacity. No matter how holy a saint is or how magnificently powerful an archangel is, their capacity to love is strictly limited by their created nature.
They are finite.
A finite creature can only ever offer a finite amount of love. They are like a teacup trying to hold the ocean. They simply do not have the capacity to offer infinite love back to an infinite God.
The math simply doesn't work. Finite beings cannot generate an infinite return.
The only way God the Father could receive a love from within creation that is adequate, infinite, and truly worthy of his own infinite goodness is if the one loving him is also infinite.
And that leads directly to the necessity of the incarnate Word. Only Christ, being fully God and fully man, can offer that adequate, infinite love back to the Father from within the created universe.
Therefore, Allegra argues, Christ must be the first willed among all creation. The Latin term he uses here is primum volitum.
Before the galaxies were formed?
Before the angels were created, before Adam and Eve ever walked in the garden, God willed Christ. The entire universe was spoken into existence to be the environment, the physical stage for this ultimate exchange of infinite love.
This is a breathtaking, expansive vision. It completely moves the center of gravity in theology away from human failure and places it squarely on divine love. But, as beautiful as it sounds, it brings up a massive historical and textual problem.
The contrary texts.
Yeah, this brings us to the third assertion. Because if you read the ancient writers, the great authorities of the church figures like St. Augustine, or even the Apostle Paul in certain passages, they seem to say very explicitly that Christ came into the world to save sinners.
The Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost.
Yes. If Christ was plan A, if he was coming regardless of the fall, why do so many foundational texts frame his arrival as a rescue mission? How did Scotus deal with centuries of tradition that seemed to contradict his thesis?
Scotus handles this with what is arguably his most brilliant theological distinction. He doesn't discard the ancient writers. He doesn't say St. Augustine was wrong. Instead, he synthesizes them. He argues that we must distinguish between the incarnation itself and the manna of the incarnation.
Okay, break that down for me.
Scotus agrees that Christ would not have come as a suffering redeemer in passible, vulnerable flesh if man had not fallen.
We should define passible flesh here. In theology, passible means capable of feeling pain, capable of suffering and dying.
That distinction is crucial. Scotus is saying that if Adam had not sinned, the Word would still have become flesh. The incarnation would still have happened. Christ would still have entered the universe. However, he would have come in glory as the radiant crown of creation, bringing the universe to its ultimate perfection without suffering or death.
So the sin of humanity didn't cause the incarnation to happen, it only altered the conditions under which Christ arrived.
The suffering was conditional, but the arrival was absolute.
I see. Because humanity was broken, because that shed window was shattered, Christ chose to adapt his arrival. He arrived in a broken, passible state to heal it.
He descended into the mess.
That harmonizes the scriptures beautifully. I'm thinking about the letters of St. Paul. In some places, Paul talks about the historical Jesus, the man who was crucified for our sins, the suffering servant. But in other places, like the letter to the Colossians, Paul paints this sweeping cosmic picture. He says all things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. For a long time, scholars have struggled to fit the cosmic universal Christ together with the crucified historical Jesus.
Scotus provides the missing link that ties those two images together. The cosmic Christ is the eternal plan A. He is the primum volitum. The crucified Jesus is that exact same cosmic Christ, willingly adapting his arrival to the tragic reality of human freedom and sin. He doesn't come because the mess caused him to exist. He comes because his infinite love demands that he meet his creation where it currently is.
And that profound adaptation brings us to the most poignant part of Allegra's treatise, which is the fourth assertion. This deals with what Scotus calls the necessity of consequence and the overwhelming magnetism of the cross.
This is where we ask the truly difficult question.
Yeah, if he was going to come anyway, and if he had to adapt to our sin, why did he choose the cross? Was the gruesome, horrific crucifixion strictly, legally necessary to satisfy God's justice?
This is where the Franciscan thesis diverges sharply from other medieval frameworks, and we need to understand the historical context here. In the Middle Ages, theology often heavily borrowed from the language of the courtroom and feudal systems of justice.
Like St. Anselm.
Yes, thinkers like St. Anselm proposed the satisfaction theory. They argued that an offense against an infinite God, which is what sin is, required an infinite punishment or an infinite payment to balance the scales of justice. Therefore, they reasoned, only the death of the God-man could pay that infinite debt. It was viewed as a strict legal necessity.
But Scotus looks at this framework and argues something completely different.
He says that Christ's intense suffering on the cross was not strictly necessary for salvation.
I want you to pause and think about the weight of that claim if you're listening. For a medieval theologian to say the cross was not strictly necessary, that is a staggering departure from the norm.
Scotus argues that God, being omnipotent and perfectly free, is not bound by a rigid cosmic ledger. He could have accepted a lesser satisfaction. He could have accepted the intercession of a powerful angel on our behalf.
Wait, an angel could have done it?
In theory, God could have accepted that. He could have even strengthened a mere human being with enough grace to offer a sufficient apology on behalf of the entire human race.
Oh, yeah.
In fact, Scotus argues that the abasement of the incarnation alone, just the sheer humility of the infinite God becoming a finite, vulnerable human being, would have been infinitely meritorious and more than enough to reconcile humanity to God.
So if the scales of justice could have been balanced in 1,000 different, far less painful ways, if just showing up in human flesh was enough, why the cross? Why the unimaginable physical and spiritual agony of Calvary?
Scotus answers this with a specific Latin phrase that Allegra highlights deeply in his treatise, adolescendum nos amorem suum. Translated, that means to attract us to his love.
To attract us, it shifts the entire paradigm of salvation.
It takes the crucifixion completely out of the sterile, punitive courtroom and places it into the realm of radical romance.
It is not about a wrathful judge demanding a cold legal quota of blood to satisfy an angry ledger. It is a lover making the ultimate, overwhelming gesture to win back a heart that has turned away.
Scotus says God willed it this way so that man would be more bound to God. Think about human psychology. When you realize that the person who loves you didn't have to suffer, that there was no legal requirement forcing them to endure pain, but they freely chose the most agonizing path possible simply to prove the extent of their love.
The psychological impact is profound.
It absolutely shatters the transactional view of religion.
I look at this and see how it completely dissolves the image of a divided Trinity. You know, the image of a wrathful father demanding the death of his suffering son. In this framework, the Father and the Son are entirely united in this supreme, proactive act of charity.
Which leads perfectly into the fifth and final assertion of this core theology, the transition from a drama of justice to a drama of love.
Allegra concludes that under this scotistic framework, the entire narrative of redemption changes completely. It is removed from all external influences. It is no longer about paying a ransom to the devil, as some early church fathers thought.
It is no longer about satisfying the abstract, unyielding demands of pure justice. The entire story of the universe is rooted exclusively in the pure, ardent love between the Father, the Son, and mankind.
It is an insular fire of love. The universe exists for the incarnation. The incarnation happens because infinite love desires to give and receive infinite love, and the cross happens because that same love refuses to let humanity slip away, choosing the most magnetic, irresistible method possible to pull us back.
That leads to a profound philosophical and personal question for anyone pondering this theology. If God went to such extreme lengths purely out of love, when he had countless other, easier options available to him, what is the natural human response to that realization?
That response is captured in a phrase that became the defining motto of Gabriele Allegra's entire life. The phrase is, "Eo multum tenemur I," which translates to, "Therefore we are greatly indebted to him."
Allegra was so moved by the specific line from Duns Scotus that he actually titled his own autobiographical memoirs with those exact words.
The psychology of this debt is fascinating, and it is crucial to understand it properly, because man could have been redeemed in another, easier way, but Christ freely chose the most agonizing way purely to win our love. Our debt of gratitude is exponentially higher than if he had simply balanced a cosmic ledger because he had no other choice.
Now, you might push back on that word debt.
Yeah, I do want to push back on that for a moment, because for you, the listener, debt probably carries a lot of modern baggage. In our modern vocabulary, debt usually implies guilt or a transactional financial relationship. It feels heavy, like a mortgage or a penalty hanging over your head.
That is a fair point.
If this whole theology is about moving from a drama of justice to a drama of love, doesn't introducing the concept of a massive debt drag us right back into the courtroom? How do we escape the ledger?
That is a vital distinction to make, because the translation of concepts over centuries can be tricky. In the Franciscan view, and specifically in Allegra's writings, this debt is not a legal penalty. It is not a financial obligation that you must grind away at in order to avoid punishment.
Okay, so what is it?
It is an overwhelming compulsion of charity. Imagine a stranger diving into a freezing, turbulent river to save your life when they could have simply tossed you a life preserver from the safety of the bridge.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
The debt you feel toward that person isn't a legal liability. You don't owe them a check. It is a profound, life-altering gratitude that changes how you view them, how you view humanity, and how you view the value of your own life.
You feel an innate, entirely voluntary compulsion to honor that sacrifice.
Yes. And this connects directly to the core of the Franciscan ideal. The sources describe the ultimate goal of the Franciscan life as becoming an angel of the face of Jesus.
That is such a striking, poetic image, an angel of the face of Jesus.
It means conforming oneself entirely to Christ. When Franciscans take their vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, they are not doing it to punish themselves. They are not fulfilling a grim, stoic obligation. They're doing it to mirror the life of Christ.
They look at the sheer extremity of Christ's love on the cross, and their only logical, sane response is to try to match that love by emptying themselves.
Poverty is not about despising material things or thinking the world is bad. It is about removing barriers to love. Obedience is not about crushing your own will. It is about uniting your will perfectly with God's will.
Allegra quotes Scotus saying that charity is both the end and the content of Scripture. It is the absolute center toward which everything converges. So this det ideo multum tenmer I is really just the gravitational pull of divine love acting on the human heart. You see the love, you feel the sheer weight of what it cost, and you are irresistibly drawn to mirror it back into the world.
And Allegra lived this out in the most grueling way possible. His decades of translating the Bible in China, the isolation, the linguistic struggles, the physical exhaustion, that was his way of paying this debt of love. He was mirroring the incarnation by incarnating the Word into a new language, driven entirely by this profound gratitude.
Now, this vision of a universe built purely on love, a cosmos centered entirely on Christ from before the Big Bang. You might think this is just a beautiful piece of medieval mystical poetry.
A theological abstraction.
Yeah, strictly for monks in a cloister, entirely disconnected from the modern world. But here's where the story takes one of the most surprising historical turns in all of our source material. This 13th century theology actually caught the attention of one of the 20th century's most famous and controversial scientific minds.
The setting for this encounter is Beijing, China, between the years 1942 and 1945. World War II is raging globally. China is in absolute turmoil. And in this chaotic, isolated environment, two extraordinary minds cross paths. One is Blessed Gabriele Allegra, our Franciscan translator immersed in the medieval texts. The other is Pierre Teilhard de Chardin.
For those who might not know, Teilhard de Chardin is a massive, complex figure in 20th century thought. He was a French Jesuit priest, but he was also a highly respected paleontologist and geologist. He was deeply involved in the famous discovery of pink man.
Teilhard spent his entire life trying to reconcile the massive scope of evolutionary science in deep time with Christian theology. He was trying to bridge the laboratory and the altar.
Teilhard was looking at the fossil record, the vastness of the universe, and the trajectory of evolution, and he theorized that the entire universe was evolving toward a supreme point of complexity and consciousness. He famously called this the omega point.
For Teilhard, this omega point was not just a blind natural phenomenon, it was the cosmic Christ who draws all of creation to himself. But Teilhard often struggled to find traditional theological frameworks that could comfortably house this massive evolutionary vision.
So you have Teilhard, the scientist, looking forward into deep time and cosmic evolution for the cosmic Christ. And on the other hand, you have Allegra, the scholar of medieval theology, holding the texts of Duns Scotus from 700 years prior.
Our sources recount the actual dialogue between these two men during those years in Beijing. Allegra shares the Franciscan thesis with Teilhard, the absolute primacy of Christ, the idea that the physical universe was created specifically for the incarnation, that Christ is the primum valium.
And Teilhard's reaction is incredible. According to Allegra's memoirs, Teilhard listened to this 13th century theology and responded, "Father, thank you for what you have told me. With this theology, one not only breathes, but advances."
Teilhard then urged Allegra and the Franciscans to champion this doctrine with even greater vigor, stating that the modern church must from now on feel a cosmic Christ and needs a cosmic theology.
It is as if Teilhard had spent his entire life digging a tunnel through the mountain of modern science, desperately searching for a way to connect the material universe to the divine. And Allegra shows up and reveals that the Franciscans had already dug a tunnel from the other side starting 7 centuries earlier.
It is a remarkable moment of intellectual synthesis. Teilhard recognized that Scotus's theology wasn't just a quaint medieval idea to be studied as history. It was a robust, philosophically sound framework that could actually hold the weight of modern scientific discovery.
Because if Christ is the primum valium, the first willed, then every single stage of cosmic evolution, from the Big Bang to the cooling of the stars to the formation of the Earth, is simply the unfolding of the stage for his arrival. It gives immense meaning to the material world.
I am reminded of modern theoretical physicists who spend their entire careers searching for a theory of everything, a single, unifying mathematical equation that explains all physical forces in the universe.
Reading this exchange in Beijing, it feels like Teilhard realized the Franciscans had essentially been holding the theological theory of everything in their hands for centuries.
Allegra makes a very interesting, somewhat poignant observation in these memoirs. He gently laments that the Jesuit theologians of his day, despite their immense scientific resources, their observatories, and their brilliant minds, were often too focused on peripheral theological disputes.
He wished they would use their formidable intellectual machinery to champion this absolute primacy on a cosmic scale, instead of leaving it as a minority position kept quietly within the Franciscan order.
Allegra felt that this cosmic vision was the key to making the faith relevant and breathtaking for the modern, scientifically aware world. A universe that is a deliberate, evolving masterpiece of love is much more compelling than a universe that is just a static theater for a rescue mission.
But in this grand cosmic vision, where everything from the furthest galaxy to the smallest atom is centered on Christ, there is one other figure who is intrinsically woven into the eternal blueprint. And we have to address her role if we want to fully understand Scotus and Allegra.
This brings us to the profound connection between the primacy of Christ and Marian theology. You simply cannot discuss Duns Scotus or Gabriele Allegra without discussing the Virgin Mary. Historically, Duns Scotus is known as the Doctor of the Immaculate Conception.
He was the primary theological architect who defended this doctrine centuries before it was officially declared dogma. We need to connect the dots here for the listener. How does Mary fit into this grand cosmic architecture of the primacy of Christ? If the whole universe is built for Christ, where does she stand?
It is a matter of strict theological logic within the scotistic framework. If Christ was the first willed of all creation, and if the eternal decree was that infinite love would take on physical human form, then he needed a human mother.
The incarnation requires a vessel.
Therefore, Mary was not an afterthought. She wasn't selected at the last minute when humanity fell. She was predestined together with her Son from all eternity. In the very same divine thought that willed the incarnate Word, the Immaculate Mother was also willed.
Our sources actually quote Pope Pius IX, affirming this exact idea, that by one and the same eternal decree, God willed both the incarnation of divine wisdom and the Immaculate Mother. Because if Christ is the masterpiece, the absolute pinnacle of creation, the one who brings him into the material world must also be perfectly prepared.
Hence the Immaculate Conception, the belief that Mary was conceived without the stain of original sin, created as the perfect, spotless, untarnished environment for the Word to take flesh.
But Allegra goes even further in his writings, fiercely defending Mary's titles as co-redemptrix and mediatrix of all graces. Now, it's important to note that the term co-redemptrix often causes intense theological friction.
It sounds to modern ears like it's equating Mary with Jesus.
But Allegra clarifies it beautifully within this framework of love. He stresses that this is not about elevating Mary to the status of a god or making her equal to Christ the Redeemer. It is about her dependent but direct participation in the redemption.
It's important for us to clarify for you, the listener, that we are exploring how Allegra and Scotus frame this, purely conveying the ideas in their texts. The text provides a striking image from Allegra to explain this participation.
What does he say?
He writes, "The afflictions of Mary and those of Jesus were but one affliction which made two hearts to suffer." When Christ was on the cross, offering that supreme act of love to draw humanity back, Mary was at the foot of the cross, perfectly united to his will, offering her own unimaginable sorrow along with his.
Her compassion, and if we look at the root of that word compassion, it literally means suffering with, is deeply intertwined with his passion. If the cross was the ultimate divine act of love to draw us in, Mary's stance at the foot of the cross represents the ultimate perfect human response of love.
She is the first and greatest angel of the face of Jesus, perfectly mirroring his charity. Their sorrows were offered together to the Father. She is the human side of that infinite dialogue.
That perfectly rounds out the Franciscan theology of love. The universe isn't just a monologue of God pouring out love into a void. It is a dialogue. God gives infinite love through Christ, and humanity, perfectly represented by Mary in her unblemished state, receives that love and offers it back.
Allegra noted with great sorrow in his time that many theologians were downplaying Mary's role, often for the sake of ecumenism, trying to make Catholic theology more palatable to Protestant dialogues. They thought emphasizing her was a stumbling block.
But Allegra, sharing a deep conviction with another modern saint, Leopold Mandic, firmly believed the exact opposite.
He believed that downplaying Mary was fundamentally a mistake if you wanted true unity.
He believed that the Immaculate Mother, far from being an obstacle to unity, would actually be the victor in unifying the Church. Because true unity in this theological framework can only be achieved through the absolute perfection of charity, and Mary is the human masterpiece of that charity. You cannot separate the king from the Queen Mother in the eternal decree.
We have covered a massive expanse of intellectual and historical territory today. We started with the sheer linguistic marvel of Father Allegra laboring over the Sigao Shengjing in China, giving the divine word a Chinese body.
We journeyed backward to the 13th century genius of Duns Scotus, completely overturning the idea that the incarnation was merely a reaction to human sin. We explored the deeply psychological idea that the cross was the ultimate romantic gesture of a lover, rather than a cold legal transaction in a cosmic courtroom.
And we saw how this medieval theology expanded outward into the cosmic vision of Teilhard de Chardin, revealing a universe that was never plan B, but always an eternal canvas specifically prepared for infinite love.
It is a synthesis that challenges anyone who engages with it to reevaluate the very foundation of the Christian narrative. It asks us to see the architecture of the cosmos as entirely, eternally Christocentric.
And as we close this deep dive into the source material, we want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on this breathtaking architecture we've explored today.
If the absolute primacy of Christ is true, if the material universe, with all its vastness, deep time, and staggering complexity, was spoken into existence specifically so the incarnation could happen, so that infinite love could take on physical form, how does that alter the way we view the physical matter of the universe?
It suggests that every atom, every distant swirling galaxy, and the very fabric of time itself is not just a random, indifferent stage where human history happens to play out. Rather, it implies that the entire cosmos is a deliberate, intricately designed cathedral, built from the dawn of time solely to house the arrival of the incarnate Word.
Thank you for joining us for this conversation. We hope exploring this profound medieval blueprint has given you as much to ponder as it has given us.